As we gather this morning to celebrate our Eucharist, we recognize that we are at the midway point of our Lenten journey. And for those of us that are already having a good Lent, it is an encouragement and invitation to continue on with our practices of prayer, fasting, and discipline. And for those of us that perhaps might have been off to a slow start or have found our way off the path, we are reminded that there is still time for us to be able to use this sacred season. And each year as we gather on this fourth Sunday of our Lenten journey, we celebrate what we call Laetare Sunday. This word Laetare comes from the Latin word which means rejoice, and it gets its origin from our entrance antiphon that we would have used this morning if we did not sing an opening hymn. The entrance antiphon found in our Sunday missals comes from the prophet Isaiah. And there the prophet Isaiah was encouraging the people then, and still to us today, that now is a time for us to rejoice and to be joyful. It is an invitation, at least temporarily, for us to turn from our Lenten somberness to be able to anticipate the joy of Easter. It is meant by the Church to be a sign of hope and encouragement, to help us to continue on this journey of this Lenten season, to be able to continue to fight the good fight, to prepare our hearts and our lives to truly celebrate the passion, the death, and then the glorious resurrection of Jesus Christ. And how much more does this sense of hope resonate within us as we celebrate this Jubilee year, and as Pope Francis has invited the Church and each one of us to be pilgrims of hope this year. And in fact, as we heard all of our scripture readings proclaimed this morning, they speak to us in a very real way of what it means for us to be pilgrims of hope and how God is so near and close to us. We hear about this hope in a particular way in our gospel this morning. This morning we hear this very familiar and beautiful parable of the prodigal son. It is one that resonates within the hearts and the lives of so many believers. This parable of the prodigal son is found in the 15th chapter of St. Luke's gospel. And this chapter is often referred to as the chapter of the lost and found, because we hear three parables: the parable of the lost sheep, the parable of the lost coin, and the parable of the lost sons. And in each of these parables, we hear not only that which was lost has been found, but the joy that comes about on finding the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost son. And each time I pray this parable of the prodigal son, I'm brought back to an experience that I had almost 25 years ago. In fact, it was in July of 2002 in Toronto at World Youth Day. You will recall hundreds of thousands of young people from all over the world came to Toronto to gather with an aging Holy Father, now St. John Paul the Great. They came together from all of the corners of the earth to spend a week in prayer, in catechesis, in service, and in fellowship with one another. And as they gathered those days on the CNE grounds, it was an opportunity to celebrate our faith, to be able to rejoice and to be hopeful in the midst of all that was taking place in our world and in our lives at that moment. As we celebrated those days on the CNE grounds, across the street, the organizers used a park that was right across to be able to set up a place where the sacrament of reconciliation would be celebrated. The park was renamed Duc Immoltum for those days, coming from the Latin, which means to put out into the deep. There were over 200 confessional stations that were set up in the park each day, and young people throughout the day were encouraged to be able to go over to the park and to be able to celebrate the sacrament of reconciliation, to receive the gift of God's pardon and peace. Each afternoon, I had the opportunity to travel across to the park, to find one of the stations, and to be able to serve as a confessor to the young people that were there. Oftentimes, when I went over to the park, I would pick one of the stations that was closest to the road. It gave me an opportunity to see what was happening around. And again, I was often amazed at the myriad of young people from all over the world that flocked each and every day to come to the sacraments. On one particular day, as I was sitting at my station, I couldn't help but notice a young man, perhaps in his early 30s, that was on a set of rollerblades, and he was going back and forth on the road. I knew that he was not one of us because he didn't have the World Youth Day backpack that so many of our young people had worn throughout the week. But I noticed that he came up and down. And then after about 45 minutes, he stopped. He got off of the road and he began walking towards my station. As he approached me, he said that he wasn't one of us and that he, in fact, was a Catholic, though he had been lost in his way. He began to explain that he arrived to Canada just a couple of years ago, and as he did, he made several bad choices in his life. He did not believe that God could love him. He did not believe that he could be forgiven. He did not believe that there was any hope for him. But then he said, something began to change in these past few days. He said, as I rollerbladed through this area over these days, I saw the joy of these young people from all over the world. As I listened to the reports on the media about what was taking place, I couldn't help be touched. As I saw young people coming day in and day out to use the sacrament of reconciliation, he said, I began to think, could this be possible for me? And so he found himself there that day and asked if I could hear his confession. Over the next half hour or so, he opened up his heart about the brokenness, about the failure, about the sinfulness that was there. He spoke about how he felt unloved and unwanted. He spoke about how he thought he could never be forgiven. But then, as we celebrated reconciliation, a glimmer of hope began to appear in his teary eyes, and he began to come to know that he was loved and accepted by God, and that it was possible for a second chance and a new beginning. A few days after that encounter, our World Youth Day celebrations moved from the CNE grounds to Downsview Park for the overnight vigil and the closing Mass with our Holy Father, Pope John Paul the Great. Nearly 1 million+ people gathered in Downsview for the vigil and the closing Mass. And in his closing homily, now St. John Paul the Great spoke to the pilgrims of what it meant to be a people of hope, what it meant to be a people of joy, what it meant to be a people that were given a second chance and a new beginning. And the words that he spoke then continue to resonate in my heart today. St. John Paul said these words, "We are not the sum of our weaknesses and failures. We are the sum of the Father's love for us and our real capacity to become the image of his Son." As I heard St. John Paul say these words, I couldn't help but think of that young man that I met that day on the rollerblades. I couldn't help but think of the hundreds of young pilgrims that I had celebrated the sacrament of reconciliation with that week. I couldn't help but think about my own self and my own journey of faith, that we are not the sum of our weaknesses and failures, but instead we are the sum of the Father's love. And the challenge and the invitation to each of us is to become the image of the Son. And as we heard this morning, this parable of the prodigal sons, This ultimately is at the heart of what Jesus is speaking about. To be able to accept that they are the sum of the Father's love, and that they have the capacity to become the image of Jesus. This is the invitation that both of the sons in the parable are offered. And yet, we hear, as wonderful and as gracious as this invitation is, only one of the sons, the younger son, accepted it and came to realize that he was not the sum of his weaknesses and failures, but instead he was the sum of the Father's love, and accepted the invitation and the challenge to become the image of Jesus. But sadly, we hear that at least at this moment, for the elder of the sons, he was not willing or able to recognize that he was the sum of the Father's love. He was not willing or able, at least at that moment, to be able to accept the invitation to become the image of Jesus and to follow in his footsteps. But to both the younger and the older son, the invitation and the gift was placed there. This invitation and gift was not only placed to these two sons, it was not only placed to that young man on the rollerblades long ago, and the thousands of young people that experienced the sacrament of reconciliation during World Youth Day, but it is also the invitation and the gift that is given this morning to each and every one of us and extended day by day, that we too are invited to be able to accept into the depths of our hearts and our lives that we are the sum of the Father's love, that we are not defined by our weaknesses and our failures. We are not defined by our sinfulness and our brokenness, but what defines us is that we are children of the Father, a Father who gives to us a gracious, a free, an unconditional, and a merciful love day in and day out. And therefore we do not need to be trapped or paralyzed by our sinfulness or our brokenness, but like the younger son, like the young man on the rollerblade, to recognize that there is hope, that we can have a new beginning and a fresh start when we accept the gift of the Father's love. And when we accept that gift of the Father's love, and God's transforming grace is at work in our hearts and our lives, then it becomes easier for us to become that image of his Son and to follow in the footsteps of Jesus. And so what about us? Today and every day, do we accept that invitation and that gift? Are we able to be like the younger son and to accept the Father's love? Or do we stay outside like the elder son, refusing and rejecting it? We are not the sum of our weaknesses and our failures. We are the sum of the Father's love for us and our real capacity to become the image of his Son. This is why today, as we celebrate Laetare Sunday, we should rejoice and be hopeful, for the God of love comes to us today and every day to be able to bestow his love, his grace, his mercy upon us.